He owned a logistics and supply chain empire worth over $1.4 billion, wealthy enough to never have had to hit the brakes for anyone on a dark highway. But that night, amidst a blinding rainstorm sweeping across western Tennessee, he stopped his truck because of a solitary woman clutching an infant to her chest beside a flooded ditch. She said exactly 11 words. "We do not need charity, mister. We just need somewhere dry." That single sentence would follow him all the way back to a locked door at the end of his hallway, a door he had kept sealed behind a brass padlock for 11 long years. A door he believed would never open again in his lifetime. But it all began with one split-second decision on that rain-soaked stretch of asphalt. Before our story continues, if stories about quiet resilience, unyielding dignity, and the healing of wounded souls mean something to you, take a brief moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what you would have done if you stood on that flooded road. Now, let us go back to that stormy night, where one single turn of the steering wheel was about to alter two fractured lives forever. He almost drove past her. Sterling Hayes had been driving for nearly 48 minutes through the relentless tail end of a severe autumn storm sweeping east from Memphis. Both of his large, calloused hands gripped the leather steering wheel, his mind occupied with only one objective: reaching Blackwood Ridge before the low-lying creeks along Highway 64 overflowed completely. The quarterly executive board review had dragged on until 10:14 that night. He was 51 years old, exhausted to his bones, and tonight he wanted nothing more than to step into his silent house, turn off the lights, and sit alone in the dark as he had done for over a decade. Rain smashed against his windshield in violent waves. The heavy wipers running at maximum speed could barely clear the glass. The high beams of his dark gray pickup swept across a sharp bend in the road. At the muddy edge of the shoulder, an irregular shape stood out against the darkness, too slender to be a telephone pole and too upright to be a fallen tree limb. He tapped the brakes, leaning forward slightly to pierce the murky darkness with his gaze. A woman. She stood with her back, bracing against the punishing gale, leaning slightly forward in the unmistakable posture of someone who had walked against bitter winds for far too long. She was no longer pretending the storm would pass quickly. Her denim jacket was drenched black, clinging heavily to her narrow shoulders. Her braided hair was plastered flat against her temples by the icy downpour. She held a bundle tight against her chest, wrapped inside a thick fleece blanket and shielded by both of her forearms, as if her own flesh were an impenetrable shelter. Sterling slowed the truck to a crawl and rolled his window down a fraction of an inch. "Ma'am, are you all right out here?" He called out over the roar of the wind. "I am fine," she answered immediately, keeping her chin up and her gaze fixed ahead. That was obviously untrue by every visible measure. "You are soaked through, and the water in that ditch is rising fast," Sterling said, glancing at the silver sedan tilted into the muddy verge behind her. "Where's your tow truck?" "I called dispatch 22 minutes ago," she replied with the flat, unvarnished tone of a person accustomed to bracing for bad news. "They told me 2 hours minimum." The bundle against her chest stirred, letting out a faint, raspy cough that was swallowed by the thunder. Sterling felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a memory rising unbidden from 32 years in his past. He thought of his late mother, Eleanor, who had worked third shifts at a textile mill for 26 years, and the simple rule she always repeated whenever someone was stranded in the cold. "You stop because a human being needs shelter, Sterling. You do not interrogate their misfortune first. Stop first, then ask." He put the transmission into park, pulled the emergency brake, and stepped down into the ankle-deep water. "My name is Sterling Hayes," he said, halting 8 paces away so she would not feel cornered in the dark. "My place is 6 minutes up this ridge road. Take a picture of my license plate and text my registration number to whoever you need to feel safe, and I will wait right here until you are ready." The woman studied him under the glare of his headlights, the freezing rain falling like a curtain between them. She glanced down at her phone, displaying an 11% battery warning, understanding clearly that her options had narrowed down to 0. "My name is Kendra Vance," she said, snapping a clear photo of his rear bumper and sending it to a close friend in Shelby County, along with a brief location pin. He stood perfectly still in the rain, not rushing her by a single second. When she finally nodded, he stepped forward to take the heavy diaper bag from her shoulder. Inside the cab, as the truck climbed the winding private lane toward Blackwood Ridge, Kendra stared out at the sprawling 120-acre estate with an analytical, guarded gaze. She noticed the impeccably manicured fences, the dark timber barns, and the wide gravel drive where not a single stone was out of alignment. It was clearly the residence of an exceptionally wealthy man, but the overwhelming stillness told her that no family had breathed life into it for years. "You do not have to let us inside your main house," Kendra stated firmly as the engine died. "If you have a heated utility room or a dry spot by the workshop, that is more than enough for the night." Sterling turned off the headlights and looked at the 6-month-old infant sleeping in her arms, little eyelids trembling from the damp chill. "You will sleep in the guest wing," he answered quietly. "There is hot water and dry linen inside." The interior of Blackwood Ridge carried the distinct atmosphere of a palace built for many, yet inhabited by only one soul for over a decade. It was not run down because Sterling Hayes possessed the discipline of an engineer, but there was a sharp emptiness that money could never furnish. The dining table had only a single place setting laid out. The entry coat rack held only one heavy wool coat. Kendra registered every detail within the first 45 seconds, storing each observation away with the sharp precision of a woman who had spent years surviving on her wits. The man who brought her here was carrying a deep, unhealed loss. He kept this house the way one maintains a shrine, meticulously preserved but completely devoid of joy. She also noticed the locked oak door at the far end of the eastern hallway, secured with a polished brass padlock. She did not ask a single question. He warmed a bowl of vegetable soup from the refrigerator, toasted 2 slices of wheat bread, and set them on the kitchen island alongside a stack of dry bath towels. He sat opposite her, keeping an intentional distance of 4 feet so she would feel entirely unthreatened. Halfway through the meal, little Aaliyah woke up, her dark, luminous eyes fixing directly upon Sterling with the total, unblinking curiosity of a 6-month-old child. Sterling looked back at the baby and something profound flickered behind his stoic eyes, an emotion so sudden and painful that he clamped his jaw tight to suppress it. "She is staring at you," Kendra said softly, breaking the silence. "She has sharp eyes," Sterling replied, his voice careful and quiet. Kendra did not probe further. He did not offer any explanation. Outside, the storm continued to beat against the stone walls of the estate. And in that vast kitchen, a billionaire who had spent 30 years running from his mother's ghost sat sharing bread with a penniless mother who was running for her daughter's life. Around 1:15 in the morning, the deep silence of the house was shattered by a dry, frantic cough from the guest suite. Sterling, who had not slept, stepped into the hallway and saw Kendra standing in the doorway, holding Aaliyah against her neck as the child burned with a sudden violent fever. The real trial of that night was about to begin. The fever arrived with ruthless speed at exactly 1:17 in the morning. Kendra woke instantly because she felt an unnatural heat radiating from the small body curled against her ribs. She sat upright on the edge of the mattress, placing the flat of her palm across Aaliyah's forehead, and felt that icy knot of maternal panic tighten deep in her stomach. It was the kind of terror that bypasses the rational mind and strikes straight at the bone. She did not lose control. She systematically recalled the emergency protocols the public clinic nurses in Memphis had drilled into her 6 months ago. The baby was breathing at 44 shallow breaths per minute, her tiny chest expanding rapidly under the fleece onesie. Her lips remained pale pink, but her skin burned with a dry, punishing temperature that had already reached 102.8 degrees. Kendra retrieved her cracked smartphone, dialed the 24-hour pediatric nurse triage hotline, and gave the operator a concise 60-second clinical summary of the symptoms. The triage nurse did not hesitate. An infant under 6 months, with a sudden spike over 102 degrees, needs an immediate physical assessment by an emergency physician. The voice through the speaker crackled flatly. "Do not attempt to manage this at home overnight." Kendra severed the call, wrapped Aaliyah in a dry wool blanket, and stepped out into the dark hallway, debating whether she could find a ride service in rural Fayette County without waking the stranger who owned the house. She did not have to make that calculation. Sterling was already standing at the threshold of the kitchen, fully dressed in his denim work shirt and heavy boots, because sleep had abandoned him decades ago. He took one look at Kendra's posture, saw the feverish flush on the infant's cheeks, and reached for the heavy brass ring of truck keys hanging by the mudroom door. "Her fever spiked past 102, Kendra said, keeping her voice strictly level to keep her hands from shaking. "The triage line directed me to the nearest emergency department. Somerville Memorial is 11 miles south," Sterling said. pushing the heavy timber door open into the damp night air. "We will be in the bay in 14 minutes." The storm had softened into a steady gray drizzle that slickened the dark country roads. Sterling drove with a controlled surgical precision, his eyes locked on the narrow yellow lines, while Kendra sat in the passenger seat, rhythmically rubbing Aaliyah's damp palms to keep her soothed. The car was quiet except for the baby's ragged, whimpering sighs. Sterling knew he could pick up his phone and call the chief executive of the regional hospital network, a man who sat on two of his corporate philanthropic boards. He could have a private trauma suite prepped, a pediatric specialist waiting at the ambulance bay, and a bypass around every piece of administrative red tape in the county. The thought lingered in his mind for exactly 3 seconds. Then he remembered the sharp, unyielding pride in Kendra's eyes when she stood in the mud on Highway 64. He glanced sideways at her and kept his voice calm. "I can call ahead to the hospital director so they clear an intake room immediately, or we can walk through the emergency triage like every other working family in this county. The choice belongs to you." Kendra looked at him, genuine surprise parting her guarded expression for a brief moment. "We take the front door," she answered without hesitation. "I do not cut lines, and my daughter does not need special treatment to get basic care." "Understood," Sterling said, nodding once. He did not offer a single counter-argument, and she noted the total lack of patronizing pity in his quiet acceptance. The emergency waiting room at Somerville Memorial was illuminated by buzzing institutional fluorescent tubes that cast a harsh white glare over 54 gray plastic chairs. The air was dense with the sharp tang of isopropyl alcohol, wet wool, and cheap floor bleach. They sat together in the fourth row near the intake desk, Kendra holding the baby upright against her chest, while Sterling sat with his spine pressed straight against the plastic backrest, his broad hands resting flat on his knees. 6 chairs down, a young working-class couple sat huddled under a thin coat, the husband rocking a coughing toddler, while the exhausted mother pressed her forehead against his shoulder. Sterling stared at them, and an invisible fist seemed to close around his lungs. 32 years ago, he had occupied a plastic chair identical to this one at the Memphis General Charity Ward. He remembered the exact beige square pattern of the linoleum tiles he had counted for 4 straight hours while waiting for news about his mother. He remembered the sound of the squeaking rubber wheels of an orderly's cart, and the hollow, hurried look on the resident doctor's face before the man even managed to say that Eleanor's kidneys had shut down completely. He remembered having only $6.18 left in his pocket, unable even to buy a cup of black coffee from the vending machine down the hall. Sterling did not speak a single word about that night. He simply sat there, his large hands cling into tight white-knuckled fists before slowly releasing them, over and over in a quiet struggle against the ghost that haunted him. Kendra, who had been listening to Aaliyah's shallow breathing, turned her head and noticed the rigid tension in the man beside her. She saw the faint pulse hammering in his jawline and the vacant wounded darkness behind his eyes. She did not interrogate him. She simply extended her right hand, calloused from thousands of hours running heavy denim through industrial sewing machines, and placed her fingertips lightly on the cuff of his denim sleeve for 3 quiet seconds before withdrawing them. Sterling turned his head to look at her. She met his gaze with a steady, solemn understanding that required no vocabulary. They were two people who recognized the weight of a heavy past without having to measure it aloud. At 2:48 in the morning, the triage nurse called Aaliyah's name. Sterling stood up to follow them toward the examination corridor, then abruptly halted at the threshold. "I will wait out here in the chairs," he said softly, giving her privacy. "Unless you want another set of ears inside." "Come inside, Sterling," Kendra replied, using his first name with a quiet naturalness that felt like an unvoiced pact between them. The attending physician was thorough, examining the infant's ears, checking her throat, and listening to her lungs with a cold stethoscope that made the baby wail. The diagnosis was an acute middle ear infection that had escalated due to the sudden damp chill of the evening. The doctor prescribed a round of liquid amoxicillin, gave Aaliyah an initial dose of infant acetaminophen to break the fever, and handed Kendra a printed discharge sheet detailing a 7-day monitoring regimen. By 3:55 in the morning, the fever had retreated to 99.4 degrees, and the baby was asleep soundly against Kendra's shoulder. The drive back to Blackwood Ridge took place under a dark, thinning sky where the rain had finally vanished into a low-hanging ground fog. Kendra stared out at the passing fence posts, the orange glow of the dashboard casting long shadows across her tired face. "Thank you," she said, breaking the silence as the truck turned onto the private drive, "for letting me handle the desk back there." Sterling kept his eyes on the winding gravel. "You did not need me interfering with your decisions. Most men with your kind of money would have taken over the whole room within 2 minutes just to prove they could," she said, her voice carrying the memory of past wounds. "They call it helping, but what they really want is the steering wheel. I have spent 30 years watching powerful men mistake control for kindness," Sterling said quietly, pulling the truck to a stop in front of the stone portico. "I have no interest in playing that game with anyone." They stepped into the quiet house just as the eastern horizon began to bleed into a pale slate-gray dawn. Kendra carried the sleeping child into the guest suite, laid her gently in the center of the bed, and walked into the small sitting area connected to the room. Sterling went to the kitchen to prepare a pot of black coffee, but when he passed the open doorway of the guest parlor 40 minutes later, he stopped dead in his tracks. Kendra was sitting on a low wooden bench near the window under the dim lamplight, her posture ramrod straight despite 30 hours without rest. In her lap lay her damp denim jacket, the shoulder seam torn from carrying the heavy diaper bag through the mud. She held a thin steel needle and a spool of heavy waxed thread she had pulled from her pocket, stitching the heavy fabric with blinding speed, rhythmic discipline, and microscopic precision. Every pull of the thread was clean, tight, and executed with the effortless mastery of a master artisan. Sterling stood frozen in the dark corridor, staring at the movement of her fingers as his heart hammered against his ribs. It was the exact, unmistakable rhythm of his mother Eleanor, who used to sit at the edge of her metal cot at 4 in the morning, mending the neighborhood's torn work coats with that same fierce, quiet dignity. He did not disturb her. He walked back to his dark office, sat down behind his massive desk, and looked out at the fog lifting from his land. For 11 years, he had believed that hard work and endurance had died with his mother in that Memphis hospital. Now, sitting right under his roof was a woman who possessed that identical unyielding spirit. He pulled open his desk drawer, took out a corporate procurement file for the upcoming regional expansion, and made a secret calculated decision that would test the very limits of Blackwood Ridge. By noon the following day, the autumn sun had burned through the morning mist, casting long golden rectangles across the wide hardwood floors of Blackwood Ridge. Sterling drove out to Highway 64 with a local flatbed operator from Somerville to recover Kendra's silver sedan. The mechanic at the regional repair shop hoisted the vehicle onto the hydraulic lift, inspected the front axle with a pocket flashlight, and delivered an unvarnished verdict. The suspension arm was sheared in two, the steering knuckle was cracked, and water had seeped past the intake manifold into 3 of the 4 cylinders. The estimate stood at $1,842.65, with a turnaround time of no less than 12 days. Sterling paid the diagnostic fee in cash without a word, drove straight into the commercial strip of Collierville, and walked into a reputable dealership lot. He selected a reliable, dark blue compact crossover, paid $32,400 via certified cashier's check, and signed the title paperwork to be transferred in blank. He withdrew $5,000 in crisp, $100 bills from his personal account, placed the currency inside a plain manila envelope, and drove back toward Fayette County with the calm satisfaction of a man who believed every human crisis was simply an arithmetic problem awaiting sufficient capital. He found Kendra in the kitchen, measuring out 4 ounces of warm formula for Alia while the baby sat babbling contentedly in the portable carrier on the island. Kendra had spent her morning scrubbing every surface of the kitchen until the stainless steel gleamed, washing the breakfast dishes by hand, and folding the laundry Sterling had left in the utility baskets. She refused to occupy any space without paying for her presence through hard labor. Sterling set the manila envelope and the electronic key fob on the quartz countertop, standing tall with the natural confidence of an executive solving a supply chain bottleneck. "The mechanic in Somerville confirmed your sedan will take nearly 2 weeks to rebuild," Sterling stated evenly, gesturing toward the keys on the counter. "The blue crossover outside is registered, insured, and yours to keep, and the envelope will cover your living expenses and nursery supplies for the next 6 months. You do not owe me anything for it." Kendra stopped stirring the formula bottle. She slowly set the plastic spoon down on a paper towel, wiped her dry fingers on her jeans, and looked at the envelope and the key fob, with an expression that turned from mild confusion into absolute, blistering coldness. The silence that settled over the kitchen was not one of grateful awe. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of an insult delivered under the guise of benevolence. She did not raise her voice by a single decibel. "Pick those up, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, razor-sharp whisper that cut straight through the warmth of the room. Sterling frowned slightly, completely unaccustomed to having a multi-thousand-dollar gesture rejected. "Mrs. Vance, you are stranded out here with an infant and no reliable transportation," he said, taking a step forward to explain his logic. "I have the financial resources to make this transition painless for you, and it makes no practical sense to refuse." "I am not a corporate charity write-off for your personal conscience," Kendra said, her dark eyes flashing with fierce, uncompromising pride. "I did not walk into your house looking for a wealthy benefactor to buy out my independence with an envelope of cash. My daughter and I are not for sale, and we do not accept handouts from men who want to feel like saints before dinner." Sterling stood frozen in the middle of his kitchen, the blood rushing to his ears as her words hit him like a physical blow. In 30 years of building his empire, no executive, banker, or politician had ever dared to speak to him with such naked, unvarnished truth. He had acted out of instinct, believing that money was the ultimate shield against suffering. But standing before this woman with her head held high and her jaw set in stone, he saw the grotesque arrogance of his assumption. He had attempted to erase her struggle with a checkbook, treating her dignity as something secondary to his ability to pay. "You are right," Sterling said quietly, after 5 agonizing seconds of silence. He picked up the key fob, slid the envelope back into his jacket pocket, and bowed his head slightly in genuine contrition. "I apologize, Miss Vance. I made a thoughtless assumption, and I will not repeat that mistake." Kendra looked at him, surprised by his immediate surrender. Every man she had encountered in her past would have flared up with defensive rage, shouting about ingratitude and demanding recognition for their generosity. Sterling Hayes simply took his money back, acknowledged his overreach, and stood waiting for her next move without a shred of resentment. "Thank you," Kendra said, her posture softening by a fraction. "My car will be ready in 12 days, and until then, I will earn our keep here by handling the cleaning and cooking. If you want to help me, treat me like a working adult, not an orphan." That evening, after Aaliyah had fallen asleep in the guest room, Kendra sat opposite Sterling at the wide kitchen table, with 2 steaming mugs of mint tea between them. The atmosphere between them had shifted from guarded suspicion to a quiet, respectful truce. Kendra placed an old spiral notebook on the table, its pages filled with neat handwritten columns, technical garment diagrams, and fabric dimension calculations. She took a sip of tea, looked out into the pitch-black farm acreage, and finally shared the truth she had carried alone across 3 state lines. "My husband, Marcus, was an industrial mechanic at an assembly plant in Nashville," she began, her fingers tracing the edge of the notebook. "He was killed 9 months ago when an overhead hydraulic lift failed during a maintenance check. Aaliyah was only 7 weeks old when they buried him." Sterling listened in complete silence, letting the gravity of her loss occupy the room without offering hollow platitudes. Marcus had a life and workplace accidental death policy worth $185,000 intended solely to be placed in a trust for Aaliyah's education. Kendra continued, her jaw tightening. "His paternal aunt, Sharon Vance, who never visited our home while Marcus was alive, filed an emergency petition in Shelby County Family Court last week seeking full temporary guardianship of my daughter. She claimed that my temporary unemployment, coupled with 8 weeks of grief counseling I attended after Marcus died, proves that I am mentally unfit and financially incapable of providing a stable home." Sterling's hands tightened around his mug, his eyes hardening into cold slate. "She wants custody of the child to gain legal control over the settlement trust." "Exactly," Kendra said, her voice trembling with restrained fury. "She hired an aggressive probate attorney in Memphis who knows how to manipulate the county system. I packed my daughter, my pattern drafting tools, and our clothes into my sedan and left Nashville because I refuse to sit in a room where someone tries to turn my honest grief into a crime. But running away will not stop the hearing scheduled for next month." Sterling sat quietly, calculating the board pieces on the table. His immediate instinct was to pick up his phone and dispatch Hayes Anchor Logistics' 6-member executive litigation team to crush Sharon Vance under 20,000 pages of corporate motions. But he remembered the sting of her rebuke from earlier that afternoon. If he used his billionaire legal machinery to destroy her opponent, he would rob Kendra of her victory and reduce her to a bystander in her own life. I know an attorney in Memphis named Regina Coleman, choosing every syllable with deliberate precision. She leads a nonprofit legal advocacy coalition that defends working-class mothers against predatory guardianship petitions. She does not take corporate retainers, and she answers to no one except the law and her clients. If you want, I will make an introduction, but you will retain her, you will direct your own case, and you will make every tactical decision yourself. Kendra looked directly into his eyes, searching for any hidden strings, and found only steady, respectful support. Yes, she nodded firmly. I want to meet her. One more thing, Sterling added, sliding a corporate memorandum across the table. Hayes Anchor Logistics is currently rebidding its regional contract for specialized fire-retardant driver uniforms and safety vests, valued at $42,000 for the initial run. The bid requires a technical pattern submission, a sample prototype that meets federal safety standards, and a competitive per-unit production cost. It is an open, blind review tender evaluated purely on technical merit by our warehouse safety committee. If you have the skill to draft the technical patterns and assemble the prototype, the RFP portal is open until next Friday. Kendra pulled the memorandum toward her, her eyes scanning the complex specifications with the sharp, effortless comprehension of a veteran pattern maker. She had spent 8 years working in commercial apparel development before the plant closed. She did not smile, but a spark of fierce, dormant ambition reignited in her eyes. I do not need your pity to win a contract, Sterling Hayes, she said, tapping the paper with her finger. Give me the fabric specs and a functional sewing machine, and I will deliver a pattern that your committee cannot refuse. The standard specifications are on page 4, Sterling replied, a rare faint smile touching his lips. The rest is up to you. 3 days later, on a brisk Thursday afternoon at 3:42, the peaceful silence of Blackwood Ridge was broken by the crunch of heavy tires on the gravel drive. A late-model Blacktown car rolled past the outer gate, stopping squarely before the stone portico. 2 individuals in dark suits stepped out onto the driveway. Sharon Vance, holding a leather folder against her chest with an air of predatory confidence, accompanied by a process server, clutching an official summons from the Shelby County Court. The battle for Aaliyah had arrived directly at Sterling Hayes' doorstep. The gravel driveway of Blackwood Ridge was lined with ancient, towering red oaks that cast long, skeletal shadows across the lawn as the Blacktown car came to an abrupt halt at 3:42 that afternoon. Sharon Vance stepped out onto the damp stones, smoothing her camel hair coat with slow, theatrical movements designed to assert total dominance over the space. Beside her, a pale, narrow-faced process server carried a thick blue-backed folder bearing the gold foil seal of the Shelby County Chancery Court. Sharon was 54 years old, with sharp, calculating eyes framed by oversized designer glasses and an expression honed by 2 decades of corporate human resources politics in Nashville. She was a woman who understood how to weaponize bureaucratic technicalities against people too exhausted to fight back. Sterling had been walking back from the lower horse paddocks when the vehicle arrived. He set down his heavy steel fencing pliers on the porch railing, wiped the damp farm dirt from his knuckles using a shop rag, and stepped deliberately toward the gravel path. He did not rush, nor did he assume an aggressive posture. He positioned himself 4 paces to the right of the porch steps, planting his heavy boots into the soil like an immovable boundary marker. Kendra emerged from the front door a split second later, holding baby Alia securely against her hip with one arm, while her other hand hung relaxed and ready at her side. She saw Sharon standing on the gravel, and though a fleeting shadow of tension crossed her brow, her spine remained rigid as an iron rod. Kendra, dear, you certainly made a dramatic spectacle out of running away from your family, Sharon began, her tone dripping with sweet, patronizing pity that was louder than the autumn wind. Hiding out on a billionaire's private estate in Fayette County will not impress the family court judge, I can assure you of that. The process server stepped forward and handed the thick legal summons directly to Kendra, who received the paperwork without allowing her fingers to tremble by a fraction of a millimeter. The hearing is officially docketed for next Tuesday at 9:30 in the morning, Division 4, Sharon said, casting a quick, calculating glance toward Sterling as if daring him to intervene. We are seeking emergency temporary custody because an unemployed, unstable widow drifting through strangers' houses cannot possibly provide the structured environment little Aaliyah deserves. If you surrender the guardianship voluntarily and sign over administrative rights to Marcus's insurance trust, I will allow you supervised weekend visits once a month. Sterling felt a surge of cold fury tighten around his chest, his corporate instincts screaming at him to summon his legal team and crush this woman with 8 different restraining orders before sundown. He took half a step forward, his jaw locked tight enough to crack enamel. But before he could utter a single word of threat, Kendra turned her head slightly and caught his eye, offering a minute, barely perceptible shake of her head. She was reminding him of the line they had drawn in the kitchen. This was her battle, her family, and her dignity to defend. Sterling exhaled through his nose, stepped back into his assigned perimeter, and crossed his arms over his chest in absolute, respectful silence. Marcus's insurance trust belongs entirely to his daughter, Sharon, and you will not touch a single cent of it while I have breath in my body, Kendra said, her voice clear, calm, and so resolute that it caused the process server to avert his gaze in embarrassment. I am not hiding from you, and I am certainly not running away from my responsibilities. I will be in Division 4 on Tuesday morning, fully prepared to speak the absolute truth under oath, and the judge will see your petition for the greedy shakedown that it is. Sharon's polished smile vanished instantly, replaced by a thin, bitter line of contempt. We will see how brave you sound when my attorney presents your psychiatric counseling records to the bench, she hissed, turning on her heel toward the idling town car. Enjoy your weekend in this mansion, Kendra, because on Tuesday afternoon, you will be leaving the courthouse empty-handed. The vehicle kicked up a plume of gray gravel dust as it accelerated down the private road toward Highway 64. Kendra stood on the driveway until the taillights disappeared into the tree line, letting out a single shuddering breath before looking down at Aaliyah, who was gurgling softly at a passing sparrow. Sterling stepped beside her, keeping his hands open and still. You handled that with tremendous grace, Sterling said quietly. She is trying to break my spirit before we even step into the courtroom, Kendra replied, looking up at the gray afternoon sky. To win that hearing, I need to prove that I have viable independent income, which means I must deliver the completed fire-retardant prototype to your logistics safety board by Monday afternoon. But the heavy flame-resistant aramid fabric requires a high-torque mechanical walking foot stitch, and my portable domestic machine cannot pierce 4 layers of that material without jamming the bobbin. Sterling looked at her for a long moment, the autumn breeze rustling the dry oak leaves between them. He felt an old heavy iron lock deep inside his chest begin to turn. Follow me, he said, turning toward the house with a voice that carried the weight of 11 years of silence. They walked together down the polished hardwood corridor of the east wing, passing the guest suite and the library until they reached the dark oak door at the very end of the hallway. The brass padlock hanging from the heavy hasp was dull and covered in a faint layer of gray dust. Sterling reached into his pocket, retrieved the small brass key he had carried every day for over a decade, and inserted it into the cylinder. The lock gave way with a sharp, heavy click that echoed through the empty house like a gunshot. He pushed the door open, allowing the pale afternoon light from the hallway to spill into the sealed room. Inside, sitting on a solid cast iron treadle stand beneath a large bay window, was a pristine 1954 Singer industrial sewing machine, its black enamel body and gold filigree decals gleaming faintly beneath a thin protective muslin sheet. On the adjoining work table rested 3 pairs of heavy tailor shears, several spools of waxed commercial thread, and an old wooden yardstick with worn, rounded edges. The air inside the room was dry and completely still, smelling faintly of machine oil, dried lavender, and old cotton bolts. This was my mother Eleanor's machine, Sterling said, his voice dropping to a near whisper as his throat tightened with 32 years of suppressed grief. She bought it used in 1968 for $45, and she used it to sew 20,000 work shirts for people all over South Memphis so I could have school books. When she passed away, I locked this door because seeing it reminded me that all my billions could never buy back 1 more hour of her life. Kendra stepped into the room with quiet reverence, setting Aaliyah down safely on the clean wool rug in the center of the floor. She approached the machine, reached out her right hand and gently rested her calloused fingertips on the cold cast iron flywheel. She turned the wheel a single revolution. The heavy steel needle rose and descended with the smooth, rhythmic, and unbreakable precision of an engine built to outlast generations. She took exceptional care of this timing gear, Kendra said softly, looking up at Sterling, with eyes full of deep, solemn understanding. A tool like this was never meant to sit in the dark like a headstone, Sterling. It was built to keep families alive through honest work. Then use it, Sterling said, stepping back into the hallway to give her the room. Bring it back to life. For the next 72 hours, the east wing of Blackwood Ridge was transformed into an engine of relentless creative industry. The rhythmic mechanical hum of the vintage Singer machine echoed through the hallways from dawn until past midnight, punctuated only by the occasional clinking of shears and the sweet sound of Kendra humming old hymns to soothe baby Aliyah. Working alongside Regina Coleman, who arrived twice over the weekend to review the court affidavits, Kendra drafted a revolutionary multi-panel safety vest prototype. She integrated reinforced double-stitched load seams, ergonomic heat dispersion vents, and quick-release breakaway closures designed specifically for commercial freight handlers. By Sunday night at 11:45, the sample garment hung completed on the dress form, perfectly meeting every single federal occupational standard with artistic precision. Tuesday morning at 9:30, the heavy wooden doors of Division 4 at the Shelby County Courthouse swung open to a crowded docket. Judge Carolyn Vance Mercer, a veteran jurist with 31 years on the municipal bench, presided over the high bench with sharp, impatient efficiency. Sharon Vance sat at the petitioner's table alongside her high-priced private attorney, smirking faintly as the lawyer launched into an aggressive 40-minute argument, portraying Kendra as an unstable, indigent mother living on transient charity. When Regina Coleman stood to present the defense, she did not rely on emotional appeals or dramatic rhetoric. She systematically submitted the original certified bank statements from the Vance Family Trust, Kendra's comprehensive discharge summary from her licensed postpartum therapist demonstrating excellent mental wellness, and an official binding letter of independent commercial residency confirming stable, leased occupancy at Blackwood Ridge's newly converted artisan carriage house. Then Kendra stood at the defense podium, dressed in a sharp dark navy suit she had tailored herself, her posture tall, calm, and unshakable. Your Honor, grieving the sudden loss of my husband was not a moral failing, and seeking professional therapy to ensure I remained a strong, lucid mother for my daughter was an act of profound responsibility, not weakness, Kendra stated, her voice resounding with absolute moral clarity through the quiet courtroom. I am an independent master pattern maker. I have never asked this city, this state, or any relative for a handout, and I will not allow my child's heritage to be plundered by those who never loved her father. Judge Vance Mercer reviewed the documentation for 4 silent, excruciating minutes before removing her reading glasses and looking directly at Sharon Vance's counsel. This court finds zero evidence of neglect, incapacity, or instability on the part of Mrs. Vance, the judge ruled firmly, bringing her gavel down with an authoritative crack. The emergency petition for temporary guardianship is hereby dismissed with prejudice, and the management of the minor child's trust shall remain strictly under the surviving mother's sole authority. 2 hours later, in the executive boardroom of Hayes Anchor Logistics, the 5-member Safety Procurement Committee concluded their blind technical evaluation of the 11 regional uniform submissions. The committee unanimously selected Kendra's prototype for its superior tensile strength, practical heat regulation, and cost efficiency, formally awarding her an initial manufacturing subcontract valued at $42,850. Sterling Hayes sat at the far end of the boardroom table as an observer, watching the committee chairman sign the contract authorization without having whispered a single word to influence the vote. He looked out the floor-to-ceiling glass window at the muddy waters of the Mississippi River, feeling a 32-year-old shackle finally snap open inside his soul. She had not won because of his fortune. She had won because she was brilliant, disciplined, and entirely unbreakable. That evening, as the golden dusk settled over Blackwood Ridge, Kendra stood before the vintage Singer machine in the open room, running her hand across the polished oak table as she prepared to make a choice that would define the rest of their lives. 14 months later, the early morning sun over Fayette County rose with a warm, crystalline clarity that painted the rolling pastures of Blackwood Ridge in deep shades of gold and emerald. The estate was no longer a silent mausoleum guarded by an isolated man running from his memories. The wide timber carriage house at the eastern perimeter of the property had been transformed into a humming, independent production atelier bearing a tasteful brass plaque by the door, Vance Apparel Dynamics. Inside the well-lit workspace, four commercial-grade modern machines hummed alongside the vintage 1954 Singer, operated by three newly hired seamstresses from South Memphis, whom Kendra had personally trained in advanced flat-fell seaming and technical pattern drafting. The business was solvent, profitable, and completely independent, having already fulfilled four major municipal safety supply subcontracts totaling $218,000. Kendra did not owe a single cent of capital to anyone. Little Aaliyah, now 20 months old, was running across the polished hardwood floors of the main house in a pair of tiny yellow canvas sneakers, her bright, unrestrained laughter bouncing off walls that had known only rigid silence for over a decade. She possessed the boundless energy of a healthy child who had never known fear or deprivation. Every morning at 6:45, before the corporate operations meetings began, Sterling Hayes could be found out by the low paddock fences with Aaliyah perched securely on his broad shoulders, patiently teaching her the names of the quarter horses as they came to graze on the fresh clover. The hollow, haunted tension that had carved deep lines into his face for 32 years had softened into a steady, grounded serenity. On a quiet Wednesday afternoon in early May, Sterling drove his gray pickup truck into the historic gates of Elmwood Cemetery in downtown Memphis. He walked past the towering magnolia trees and weathered Victorian monuments until he reached a modest, shaded plot near the southern stone wall. The granite headstone was simple, carved with the name Eleanor Hayes and the dates of a life spent in quiet, unheralded sacrifice. For 32 years, Sterling had avoided visiting this ground, because every step near it felt like an indictment of his failure to save the woman who had given him everything. He had carried his billions like a heavy iron shield, believing that because he could not rescue his mother from the exhaustion of poverty, all his accomplishments were hollow. He knelt on the damp spring grass and laid a fresh bunch of white hydrangeas against the base of the stone. He touched the carved letters with his calloused fingertips, the gentle breeze rustling the leaves overhead like a whispered blessing. Standing before her grave, he finally understood the profound truth Kendra had revealed to him. He could never reach back in time to alter his mother's fate, but he had honored her memory in the only way that truly mattered. He had learned how to use his power to open a door without demanding the right to walk through it for someone else. He stood up, drew a deep, clean breath into his lungs, and felt the heavy shackle of survivor's guilt dissolve into the warm Memphis air. He was finally free. Together, Sterling and Kendra established the Eleanor Hayes Foundation for Technical Vocational Arts, an endowment funded entirely by corporate grants and a percentage of Vance Apparel Dynamics' annual profits. Located in the heart of South Memphis, the foundation provided free, accredited 12-week master pattern-making apprenticeships, legal aid resources, and licensed childcare for low-income single mothers striving to build independent careers. It was not a charity program designed to hand out temporary scraps of relief. It was an unyielding launchpad built on the principle that human beings do not need saviors. They need fair ground to stand on, so they can rise by their own strength. The wedding took place on an October evening beneath the canopy of the 200-year-old red oak tree in the front courtyard of Blackwood Ridge. There were no extravagant corporate displays, no media crews, and no high society posturing. Only 34 close friends, local craftsmen, and community advocates gathered together on wooden benches as the sun dipped below the tree line. Regina Coleman stood in the front row, wiping a quiet tear from her eye, while little Aaliyah stood beside her mother, holding a basket of dried lavender blossoms with solemn, focused importance. Kendra wore an ivory silk gown that she had designed, cut, and stitched entirely with her own hands on the vintage Singer 1954 treadle machine. When Sterling took her hand before the officiant, his voice was deep, steady, and clear as water. "I did not fall in love with you because you needed to be protected from the world," he said, looking straight into her dark, luminous eyes. "I love you because your courage reminded me of who I was meant to be before I let grief lock me away. You walk beside me as an equal, and that is the greatest honor of my life." Kendra smiled, her eyes glistening with warm, triumphant tears that held no bitter memories of the past. "You never tried to take my steering wheel, Sterling," she answered softly. "You gave me space to fight my own battles, and you stood firm beside me when the storm was at its worst. With you, I am home." Late that evening, after the music had faded and the guests had driven back down the ridge road, Sterling stood on the wide cedar porch, leaning against the timber railing. The night air smelled of wood smoke, dry pine, and damp earth. In the distance, the yellow headlights of a lone vehicle moved along Highway 64, tracing the exact curve where he had stopped his truck in the blinding rain nearly 2 years ago. He thought of the desperate man he had been that night, driving through the storm with a closed heart and an empty house waiting for him in the dark. Kendra stepped out onto the porch, draping a heavy wool blanket across both of their shoulders, and leaned her head gently against his arm. Inside the warm living room, the soft, rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock blended with the peaceful sound of their daughter sleeping in her bed. "What are you looking at out there?" Kendra asked quietly. "Just the road," Sterling replied, wrapping his arms securely around her waist. "And the moment I decided to stop the car." "I am glad you stopped," she said, looking up at the clear, star-filled sky. "So am I," Sterling whispered. "The rest belonged to you. True wealth is never measured by the balance in a vault or the height of the walls we build to keep out our pain. True power lies in the humility to recognize another person's sacred dignity, to offer a solid ground instead of a cage, and to understand that the greatest victory in this life is not saving someone else, but standing beside them as they save themselves."